I'm here with Alexander Mercouris, editor-in-chief of the Duran. Alexander, it looks like the noose is tightening around Christopher Steele. And interestingly enough, it looks like the British press are the ones that are tightening that noose. Perhaps they sense that Steele is going to be in big trouble on the U.S. side of things, and maybe they're trying to preempt what's about to happen. You sent me a message, something along those lines, and you also sent me a message with an article via the Times of London, which is behind a paywall. But let me read you an excerpt of that, and you can comment. And it's an article which focuses on a guy named Nigel West, which is the pen name of a former Tory MP named Rupert Allison. And Nigel West was commissioned to look at the Steele dossier by a Republican law firm in 2017. So he was actually paid for to check the reliability of the Steele dossier, quote unquote, P-tape and all. That comes from the Times article. Let me read you 2 paragraphs from that. The writer, referring to West, considered Steele, a former MI6 officer, to be a friend, someone he had met on a NATO intelligence project and again at a conference on espionage in Cambridge. The pair had lunched together, so West was frankly stunned that a forensic examination of Steele's dossier and the 11 sources he cited bore none of the rigor he expected of a respected former intelligence officer. Instead, West's report, which has been passed to the Sunday Times, concludes, and I quote, "There is a strong possibility that all Steele's material has been fabricated," end quote. All of Steele's material has been fabricated. Alexander, get into this story via the Sunday Times.
Right. The first thing to say is this is an extraordinary story in the Sunday Times. And can I just say there are 2 big articles in the Times. The Times and the Sunday Times are part of the same media group. This is one of the oldest newspapers in the world. The Times and the Sunday Times for centuries have been acknowledged to be the official record, the place where the British establishment sets out its thoughts and views and reports its news. Now, they don't have that kind of prestige anymore. In fact, they're owned now by Rupert Murdoch. So that shows you that they're not, the kind of official newspapers that they once were. But having said that, there's still big newspapers in Britain. They're still absolutely a part of the mainstream, and they still do have a very close connection with the British establishment, and especially so with Boris Johnson's Conservative government. It's they support the Conservatives, and they're known to be especially close to Boris Johnson. In fact, Rupert Murdoch is known to have met Boris Johnson on the day the election was announced. So the recent election was announced. So this is a very, very important, well-connected newspaper. And the second thing to say is that this is the first big article I've seen in Britain which actually challenges the credibility of Christopher Steele, which has appeared in a mainstream British newspaper. And there are in fact 2 articles, and they are both very long, and they both go into incredible detail about the Steele dossier, about the stories about the Steele dossier, and they bring out all these all these facts. If somebody has been following the Duran, 90% of the material that you read in these articles, you will find in our discussions in the Duran. I mean, there's so much there which we are familiar with from our discussions together, Alex and I. But if you are British and if you are only getting your news from mainstream media, and there are such people, these articles will come as a shock, because none of this has appeared in the mainstream media before. I mean, they've never heard about the kind of detail that we've been discussing. I mean, they've never heard things about primary source A and primary source E and the subprime source and all this stuff. They've never heard about Michael Horowitz and his report. They've never heard about the doubts that have existed about Christopher Steele for a very long time and all the detail that we've gone into. It's all there in these articles, and it's the first time British people who, as I said, only get their opinions from mainstream news will have been confronted by them. Now, and the third thing I want to say is about this rather strange person, Nigel West, stroke Rupert Allison, as you correctly say, a former Conservative MP. The thing to say about him is that he got that name partly by writing, spy thrillers, but also he's kind of the official, semi-official voice on many issues of the intelligence services. I mean, he's known to be very, very close to the intelligence services, and he's very, very familiar with the way they work, and he speaks to them very closely, and he knows many things about them. Now, having all that introduction out of the way, my interpretation of these articles is that they are very, very carefully picked for publication at this time. And what they show is that Boris Johnson's government and the British establishment are, as we say in England, leaving Christopher Steele hanging out to dry. In other words, they are washing their hands of him. Boris Johnson and the government, the British government, have calculated that Donald Trump will survive the impeachment proceedings, that he's going to win the election in 2020. They have to, going forward, get a trade deal with the US now that they've left the European Union, that the Brexit is about to happen. So whatever mileage there was in keeping Christopher Steele going has gone. They're washing their hands of him. They're telling us finally things about Christopher Steele semi-officially through Nigel West, through the Times and Sunday Times, that people like us have known for a very long time. And they're doing it in a way that is preparing the British public for the fact that Christopher Steele is going to be dropped, and when the whole, when the whole scandal, the Russiagate scandal, reverses and implodes, and we see Barr and Durham and the American investigators closing in, the British will have set up Christopher Steele as the fall guy. He will be the person who will be blamed. The article goes into extraordinary detail about the fact that, Christopher Steele was acting on his own, that any suggestion by Republicans in the United States that he was working for the British authorities is a, quote, conspiracy theory. That's actually something that the article says. So, it's not us. We've nothing to do with Christopher Steele. Christopher Steele is this rogue agent. He's been acting entirely on his own. He's been working with Glenn Simpson. He's been putting together this obviously fabricated and untrue Steele dossier. We're not to blame. He's the person you should go after. And we now accept fully and entirely and completely that everything that appears in that dossier is a load of nonsense. And that's the story of why those articles have appeared in the Times now. Just a few little further things. I would be very curious to know which Republican law firm this is. Is that Rudy Giuliani, perhaps? Almost certainly, I think, probably not.
You mean the law firm that commissioned West?
West, exactly. Okay.
Right.
Who are these people? These famous Republican lawyers. As I said, the thought Rudy Giuliani did cross my mind. But I think on balance, probably not. But no doubt we will be learning more there.
What a piece of work these guys are. What a piece of work they are. Yeah. 3.5 years all of the British
Yeah.
mainstream media
Yeah.
has been pounding on this Russia colluded with Trump. And now here we are.
Yeah.
Here we are, and they're going to throw Steele under the bus. It is incredible. Alexander, let me read you the passage, which I think proves your point, that this is all one big bait and switch, all of it. They're changing gears now. They're changing direction. They know what's going to happen to Steele. They know that Steele is screwed, and now they're looking to all cover their asses. Here it is, Alexander, 3 short paragraphs. West's report is an explosive contribution to an affair that security sources in London acknowledge has damaged relations between Washington and British intelligence. They say Trump blames Steele for triggering the FBI inquiry into his campaign, even though it was launched before his evidence was passed to the agency. Steele's closeness to British intelligence has contributed to a conspiracy theory among Republicans that MI6 and elements of the American deep state were involved in a plot to stop Trump becoming president. It prompted Trump to accuse GCHQ of spying on his presidential campaign, something the UK's listening station took the unprecedented step of publicly denying. West believes the tensions in much of the FBI's investigation were based on a report from Steele, which he and the Bureau came to view as ridiculed with inaccuracies. Quote, he, referring to Steele, has done immense damage to relations with the U.S., a security source in London said. So, it is incredible. Incredible.
So Steele, we are the victims of Steele also, not just Donald Trump.
MI6 had nothing to do with anything.
Exactly. MI6 are the victims too. I mean, we were getting all this material from Steele. They admit, by the way, that Steele was in contact with British intelligence and was meeting with all these people and was providing British intelligence with this dossier. So, MI6 says absolutely nothing. They don't go around saying to everybody, tipping off the media in Britain, we've looked at Steele's findings. We don't believe there's any truth in them. They don't make sense. They're absolute rubbish. The Times of London, I mean, it talks about the Republican conspiracy theory about, the involvement of the British intelligence services in trying to, get Russiagate going and stopping Donald Trump. Of course, no acknowledgement by the Times of London that the Times of London has been running for 3 years this massive conspiracy, the real conspiracy theory that Donald Trump colluded with the Russians and that the whole of the rest of the media did too. Oh no, all that is, non-history now. What is history, the official story from now on in London is that we are Steele's victims. He fooled us too. He created all this bad blood between us and the Americans. There's no way we could have possibly guessed or seen through the nonsense of what he was saying. I mean, as you absolutely rightly say, I mean, it almost makes you want to reach for your vomit bag, frankly. But there we are. There are some useful. Just to say, there are also some useful revelations in these articles about the dossier. I mean, the one interesting thing that's come out of all of this is there's 2 points that we've now learned, which is firstly that the key primary source, the person who the FBI interviewed on 3 occasions in January, February, and March 2017. Before Mueller was appointed, and who told the FBI that this whole dossier is nonsense and it was all gossip and shouldn't be taken seriously. The person who was, the key source, he's now securely identified as an American businessman. I stress, an American businessman called Sergei Milyan. He is an American businessman based in the United States. He does not have Russian origins. He has some connection to Belarus, but not to Russia. So Christopher Steele wasn't getting his information directly from Russia at all. It's doubtful he has any sources in Russia. He was supposedly getting it from Sergei Milyan, except now we're told by Nigel West and the Times of London, and I stress it is they who are saying that it to us now, that Christopher Steele almost certainly, at the very least, embellished and quite possibly invented some of the stories that appear in the dossier. I mean, you read the exact words that, it's an actual active fabrication. And if you read the article carefully, if you read the two articles carefully, they make it pretty clear that it is actually Christopher Steele that Nigel West is pointing the finger at. And the key point of invention is around an individual who appears in the dossier called Primary Source E. And Primary Source E is the person who's supposed to have provided all this information about Donald Trump having met with prostitutes in the Ritz-Carlton Hotel in Moscow. And it turns out Nigel West's point about him is that Primary Source E knows too much about too many unrelated things, and that is a clear sign that there is some invention or fabrication connected to him. He's not saying that there is no such person, but that what Nigel West, I think, is saying, is that some of the things that Primary Source E is alleged to have been said were probably almost certainly not said by him, but were attributed to him by other people who had invented them. And he's making it fairly clear that it's Steele he's referring to.
Okay, 3 comments, Alexander, and then you can close out the video.
No.
Comment number 1. It was all Steele, right?
All Steele.
But in the meantime, you had Halper, Mifsud, Papadopoulos, Downer, all this stuff going down in Cambridge, in London, all of these things. But it was all Steele that was orchestrating everything.
Absolutely.
Bollocks. That's point number 1. I'm getting 3 quick points. Point number 2. Source E is a work of fiction, right?
Well,
it doesn't exist.
Largely a work of fiction, possibly entirely a work of fiction. We don't know that for a fact, but we have it on authoritative source now that he's largely, if not entirely, a work of fiction.
Right, but a FISA warrant, FISA surveillance, was dependent on this source E that doesn't even exist in order to surveil Carter Page and, in effect, move it to the Trump campaign. So all of the FISA warrants and the FISA surveillance, everything, Crossfire Hurricane, is based on a completely fictitious entity. Point number 2. Point number 3, and I'm going to go back to the Times article. This guy, Sergei Milyan, was a professional BSer. He was a joker, and I mean that in the literal sense. He was really a joker. And I quote, "More worryingly, they worked out that most of Steele's information came from a primary subsource identified by American media as Belarus-born businessman Sergei Milyan. The FBI interviewed Milyan 3 times in January, March, and May 2017. He told the FBI that he was an unwitting source, and much of what he told Steele was, quote, just talk, word of mouth, and hearsay, or conversations, and I quote, that had with friends over beers. The claims about Trump cavorting with prostitutes at the Ritz-Carlton were, quote, rumor and speculation, or said in jest. The Inspector General's report says Milyan made statements indicating that Steele misstated or exaggerated what he told him and that his reports were far more conclusive than was justified." The whole Mueller investigation, the whole soft coup against a U.S. president was based on a guy drinking beers, talking smack and nonsense about Trump.
Well, that's entirely right, except of course that it's a lot more than that actually. And let's go back to your very first point about all these activities in London, Stefan Halper in London, Joseph Mifsud in London. These people who, let's remember, Barr and Durham are taking very seriously. Barr and Durham went all the way to Rome and made inquiries about Mifsud there, and they've heard a tape by him. Now, you can believe in coincidences if you like, but I mean, sometimes coincidences stretch to impossible limits. And the idea that Christopher Steele was doing all these things all by himself, and that all these other things were going on in London with Stefan Halper and George Papadopoulos and Joseph Mifsud and all this, and this is all pure chance and
Downer, Turk,
Downer, Turk, all this, and the British authorities somehow were unaware of all this going on. I mean, that is beyond crazy. I would remind our viewers that George Papadopoulos actually gave an interview with the London Times during the 2016 election, in which he criticised, he made some extremely critical comments, which got him into trouble with the Trump campaign. So, I mean, it's as if he wasn't somebody that wasn't already on the radar where, the British authorities would have been concerned. I mean, they knew all about him. I mean, I'm talking about, this is not guesswork. The British authorities would have known all about Papadopoulos because Papadopoulos wasn't hiding. I mean, he was meeting or supposedly meeting all of these important people. He was having email contacts with the Valdai club people in Russia. All this was going on in London, and he was meeting people like Mifsud, and he was meeting people like Halper, who has, of course, intelligence connections. And of course, he was meeting the Australian High Commissioner. And we're asked to believe, in all seriousness, that the British authorities don't know about it. And this is good. I mean, it's just, there are, as I said, stories that are just beyond ridiculous. I would also remind our viewers that in the early weeks of the Russiagate scandal, especially directly after the inauguration, before the inauguration, during the transition period, there were floods of leaks in the British media, especially the Guardian newspaper, actually boasting about the cooperation that the British had provided to the US, with all the information and all that they'd passed on to the Americans about all these suspicious contacts between the Trump campaign and the Russians. So we mustn't take these denials and all these stories about what an extraordinary conspiracy theory it is, that the British were involved in starting the campaign, the collusion story and the Russiagate story. We mustn't take these denials seriously. It is. Let us stress again: it is not a conspiracy theory to say that. The conspiracy theory was Russiagate. The Times bought into it, and it is disintegrating. And the British authorities are now trying to step away from it. I would add, by the way, that Christopher Steele provided information to the British authorities, was a primary figure in building up the Litvinenko story. And he was also one of the people who provided all kinds of information about how the Russians bribed their way to the World Cup. That latter story has been discredited. Anyway.
But it's cost Russia.
It's cost Russia. It's cost Russia a huge amount of damage. So the Russians are victims of what Christopher Steele is doing. You want to talk in terms of language of victimhood. The Russians were victims. Donald Trump and his campaign were victims. To be very, very clear, the British were not victims. They were his enablers. There's no other word for it. I mean, they were his enablers, if not his accomplices. That's the first thing. Now, the second thing is about what you were saying about primary source being a work of fiction. Well, again, we're not saying that. Nigel West is saying that, and Nigel West undertook this research supposedly on behalf of a Republican law firm. But as I said, he knows the intelligence world backward. And I've no doubt that he's consulted people within the intelligence world, about these things. And I've no doubt that the Times has done so also. So maybe there is a real person somewhere, though I'm starting to have my doubts, actually. I've had my doubts about the reality of many of these sources for a long time. But maybe there is a real person. But Nigel West is saying quite clearly that it is inconceivable that one person knows all the things that are attributed to him. And the point he's making, the point Nigel West is that a real case officer, a real person involved in intelligence work would know that it is impossible that primary source E could possibly know all the things he says he knows. I mean, and that's obviously true. So when you say that this entire investigation, the Russiagate investigation, all those FISA warrants, not mentioned by the way in the Times articles, they don't really go into all that. When you say that the surveillance of Carter Page was constructed on fictions, that's true. But Michael Horowitz has said that already. The Inspector General of the FBI has all but said that. And all those things about Milian being a bullshitter. Well, that's also true. But again, Michael Horowitz has told us this. Can I also say that I think that it's clear that Milian is Christopher Steele's primary source. He is securely, as far as I'm concerned, he is securely identified as the primary source, because in Michael Horowitz's report, there is a reference to the fact that the primary source had been in touch with George Papadopoulos, which I found really, when I heard about that absolutely stunned me. And I found an article in ABC News in which it confirmed that Milian had in fact tried to reach out to George Papadopoulos. So unless that is another one of these remarkable coincidences, that seems to me to securely identify Milian as Christopher Steele's primary source. Look, what now needs to happen is absolutely clear, is we need to have some people, probably it's already happening, people like Duran and Barr and their investigators, they need to get round and have some heart-and-heart discussions with Christopher Steele, with Milian, and we need to know the whole truth about this. And of course, not just Steele and Milian, but also Glenn Simpson of CrowdStrike, Fusion GPS, who played a huge role also in propagating the Trump dossier, the Steele dossier, but who isn't, of course, mentioned in these articles either.
Yeah, I bet you a lot of people that are watching this video is probably the first time they've heard of the name Sergei Milian. No one's talking about him in the mainstream media, and that's because I bet you this guy's such a joker. They don't want to put him front and center. That's for sure. And I would also bet to say, Alexander, real quick, I'll bet you that source E could probably be 5 or 6 different people, 5 or 6 different things said, and still kind of wrap them up into one character. He kind of put them into one character. It could be like a bunch of guys.
Well, that's entirely right. I mean, the point is that as he is described in the Steele dossier, primary source E does not exist. Either he is a fiction or he is a compilation of different stories provided by many different people. Bear in mind, Milian says that he knew all about the story in the Ritz-Carlton Hotel, but it was all gossip. They were all joking about it over beers. I have to say, I read that comment in Horowitz's report as basically Milian admitting that he'd been the person who'd come up with that story as a joke. So there we go. Forget about primary source E. It's Milian joking with presumably Steele and his cronies, and Steele rushing off and creating this discussion. But I want to make clear that is my interpretation of this. We need to get to the bottom of all of this. But the fact of the matter is, we now have the Times of London and Nigel West saying this is all, there is a lot of fabrication here. I mean, they say it.
Yeah. This article is hinting that we are getting closer to the truth, and that Steele should be very, very worried.
Well, I'm sure he is very worried. He published, by the way, a defiant statement after the Times articles appeared, reiterating that he stands by his work. So there we go.
All right. Then he shouldn't be afraid to testify, should he?
Well, he should not be afraid to testify. He should be coming forward and talking about it quite freely and openly, which is something that up to now he hasn't been doing. But we will find out more in due course. I have to say, the question of I think one of the reasons they don't want to, the American media hasn't want to talk about Sergei Milyan, is because he's not Russian. He's not based in Russia. I mean, all this, the whole point about the Steele dossier is that it was supposed to be based on top secret information that was coming out of Russia. And, Sergei Milyan is an American. He lives in the United States. That's why, you remember when we talked about the Horowitz report, I said it was very interesting that the FBI was able to speak to the primary source on 3 occasions without apparently any interference or problem. And that made it almost certain that the primary source wasn't in Russia. Well, now we know for a fact that the primary source is an American. He's not Russian at all. He's based in the United States. And any idea that Sergei Milyan, of all people, has access to top secret information from the Kremlin, I mean, that's absolutely for the birds. It's absolute nonsense. It's ridiculous. I mean, I don't know much about this guy, but, it's nonsensical to think that, he knows what, Putin says to Medvedev and, all these senior officials in Moscow are saying to each other. It just isn't conceivable that he has access to that kind of knowledge. So that in itself discredits the entire dossier from my point of view. It's not Steele getting his information from the Russians, It's Steele getting his information from Milyan and perhaps inventing some more, or perhaps Milyan inventing some, and Milyan coming along and admitting a lot of it's, dreamed up over beers. I mean, it's just nonsense.
He's sitting in the U.S., Alexander. Why doesn't Tucker Carlson invite him on his show?
Well, indeed. Well,
he blows apart the entire Steele dossier narrative. He blows it apart.
Well, indeed.
This guy.
Well, indeed. Why doesn't he? But I strongly suspect that Milyan himself is now, keeping off, lying very low.
That's fine. But I've listened to Fox News continuously. To kind of get their feel for the story, especially the Tucker, Hannity, Ingram evening shows. And never once do they mention Sergei Milyan. Never once. No. Why not? Well, we're mentioning him here right now on the Duran. Why not?
Well, very good question. Absolutely. Excellent question. Can I also point out, and this is just as a parenthesis, there has been a theory floating around amongst a lot of Republicans that the Steele dossier is Russian disinformation that was put together in the 2016 election to discredit Donald Trump or to somehow compromise the entire American political process. I mean, Hannity, I know, has run with that particular theory. Well, I don't think anybody reading these articles in the Times of London can believe that any longer. The Russians have nothing to do with any of this.
Well, Sergei Milyan, once again, Sergei Milyan destroys that narrative because he's a Belarus-born American citizen, and he's the primary source. So this is an American disinformation campaign, British disinformation campaign run by Fusion GPS and the Democrats to destroy the Trump campaign and presidency.
Exactly. I mean, let's drop the Russian angle entirely. This is what the Steele dossier is very bad spy fiction. That's all it was. It was very, very bad spy fiction used to cause damage in 2016 to Donald Trump. The Russians were not involved in any shape or form. It wasn't Russian disinformation, and it certainly wasn't Russian information either. It's got nothing to do with the Russians. And as I said, Sergei Milyan and Christopher Steele have many questions to answer, and I'm sure they will be answering them.
Yeah, maybe Hannity can invite Sergei Milyan to his show so Hannity can start to get some of his facts straight instead of reporting some of his own fake news.
I think that's entirely right. I mean, we both of us have been generally very impressed by Hannity's coverage of Russiagate, but on that one, he is way off piste. I mean, he's got that theory, which I've never believed, by the way. I've never taken that theory seriously. I mean, why would the Russians want to make trouble for Donald Trump? I mean, it doesn't make it that there's never been any logic behind that theory. But regardless, we can now say conclusively that it's false.
Yeah, that's why they don't bring Milyan on the shows. I'm convinced. They don't bring him on because he pretty much debunks every single narrative, whether it's from the Democrat side or the Republican side. He pretty much destroys all of the narratives.
Exactly. And can we quickly, anticipate some comments possibly from some people? It is not pro-Russian to say that. Just read those articles in the Times. They're behind a paywall, but they make Sergei Milyan's background very clear. And by the way, you can research him on the internet. I've done so. You can find out quite a lot about him there too. So as I said, we can drop in that entire theory. Sergei Milyan's existence refutes it.
Okay, Alexander Mercouris, editor-in-chief of the Duran, thank you very much. Guys, if you like this video, click on the subscribe button down below. Click on that notifications bell, smash that like button. Please donate to us on PayPal, Patreon, and Subscribestar. Your donation really helps us out a lot. Also, download the Telegram app. Follow us on Telegram as well, so you can keep in touch with everything going on at the Duran. And visit the Duran shop to pick up some great merchandise. Alexander, I bet that Mr. West, Nigel West, if he was going to do some research on some of our magic mugs, our shirts, he would definitely say they are 100% authentic and the real deal, would he not?
Well, you certainly would, because there's nothing like them. I mean, these magic mugs, this is my oldest. This is the very first one I have, and it's the one, by the way, I drink from most, because it's the Duran one. You can see there, it's got the Duran double-headed eagle, which is just different, distinct from the Russian. In fact, if anything, it's closer to the Byzantine one or the late Roman one than the Russian one. And we have it because, as I said, he points both, it's the double-headed eagle hovering over the world, looking at east and west and getting every part of, the story, the world affairs right. So that's my oldest Duran mug. You see how beautiful it is and how extremely well it is. I drink from it, pretty much every day. Not a chip, not a crack, nothing. And how many mugs can you say that of? You have it for a year, you drink from it every day, and it still looks perfect. Well, I have to tell you, not the kind of mugs I usually drink from. I'm a very sort of clumsy person, and I drop things and do all clatter things with them. And I wash them, repeatedly, because I'm very finicky about that. So they don't really last very long. But these are perfect. So they are phenomenal mugs. And I'm sure Nigel West would indeed say, these are the absolutely authentic, completely true, absolute real deal. There is nothing fabricated about these. On the contrary, they are made in a kiln of pure porcelain, and they are superb. Absolutely true. They're exactly what you look. What you look is what you get, and they're strong, and they're light, and they keep your tea warm, as they're doing with mine at this moment. So we've got magic mugs, we've got wonderful shirts like the polo shirt I'm wearing. And if Nigel West ever saw that, he would also say that's the real deal. And I've worn it. I can vouch for that because I've worn it in all sorts of important and glittering places up and down London when I've been invited. And not just this polo shirt, but lots of others. All our polo shirts are 100% cotton. They're all incredibly well made. They're incredibly comfortable, and they are smart casual, the absolute epitome of that. And we also have, obviously, other kinds of shirts, more casual shirts, T-shirts, long sleeved and short sleeved. We've also got V-neck shirts, if your taste goes to that sort of thing. And we've got hoods, hoodies, and hats and stickers, and you can find them all in our shop. And Alex can tell you how to go to our shop. So support the Duran, own these great things, and Alex will tell you how.
Just go to theduranshop.com. The links are in the description box down below. Alexander Mercouris, thank you very much. Until next time, everybody, take care.